The Tom Woods Show, episode 2338.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey, everybody. As the academic year winds down, it's time to start thinking about what you're going to do in the fall. And of course, I highly recommend the self-taught K through 12 Ron Paul curriculum. Not only will your kids get the real story about everything, but they'll also learn the kinds of practical things that they won't learn in the traditional school. For instance, how to be an effective public speaker, how to manage money, and how to run your own home business. And of course, when they reach the high school grades, they will be learning Western civilization and U.S. government from old Tom Woods here. But here's the most important thing. If you're going to join, make sure you join through my link, because only through my link do you get $160 worth of free bonuses. My link is ronpaulhomeschool.com. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. So glad to be joined once again by Paul Gottfried, who is editor of Chronicles Magazine, the magazine where I had my very first article published all the way back in 1993. So check out chroniclesmagazine.org. I'm sure they have my initial article in a special place somewhere on the site. I'm sure you'll be able to dig around and find it. But anyway, Paul holds a PhD in history from Yale. He's a Guggenheim recipient. He's emeritus at Elizabethtown College, author of many books. And today I want to talk about conservatism and libertarianism. And this is the kind of topic you think, I've heard this a million times, but I'm not so sure. It's certainly not the way I want to do it today. So at any rate, Paul, welcome back.
Well, thank you for having me once again.
We'll put in a big plug for Chronicles Magazine at the end. And remember, everybody, remember the satisfaction you used to get of opening your physical mailbox and pulling out a physical magazine and being able to just flip through it while you're having lunch or relaxing in your recliner. I'm sorry, but some electronic device, which you can also use to read Chronicles, by the way, but to me, getting the print magazine in the mail, there's just no substitute for that. And maybe I'm a boomer or something. Maybe I'm old-fashioned. Okay, there are a lot worse things that could be said about me, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Paul, here's where I want to start. With libertarianism, it's very easy to explain where you're coming from because your foundations are so basic and elementary. You have the quote-unquote non-aggression principle. So in effect, you're saying, I'm just against the initiation of violence. And you figure that's got to be appealing to somebody because on some level, we all teach our kids that violence is not the way to go. If you're on the playground, you don't just hit the kid. We all teach that you should avoid violence. So it seems like a moral intuition that should have broad appeal. Now, as it turns out, it doesn't, but you would think it would. But the point is, libertarianism is very, very easy to understand in that way because all you're really doing is pulling out the implications of what it means not to initiate aggression. And it turns out that that has very, very radical implications. It rules out, in some versions of libertarianism, literally everything the state does. And so, yes, it has very, very radical implications, but it's very easy to get. It's just, don't commit aggression. Now, conservatism does not have any one principle that it can point to and say, this is the key, the magic key that unlocks our position on everything. It doesn't have that, and it would even be disdainful of that. It would think that you're reducing the complexity of life to an excessively simplistic proposition. And yet conservatism seems to be more popular than libertarianism, even though libertarianism is easier to grasp and really asks only one thing of you. So I guess what I want to start with is conservatism, there are so many brands of it that I can't say, well, what are the, if there could be said to be first principles of conservatism, even if we could say that, well, what kind of conservatism are you talking about? Are you talking about Burkean conservatism? Are you talking about a more reactionary style of conservatism? Are you talking about a theocratic style of conservatism? So when you talk about conservatism, what are you talking about? And what would be, again, I don't want to say first principle because Russell Kirk wouldn't like me to talk that way, but what would be like the foundational ideas from which you build to reach your finished product of a coherent way of thinking called conservatism?
Yeah, I think you're right that the term conservatism, like libertarianism, has been used to describe so many things and so many persuasions, and perhaps most notoriously and egregiously by Republican pundits and TV networks and so forth, that by now the term has been almost emptied of any specific historical meaning. But if you ask me what I understand as conservatism, I would say that I'm not sure it has any kind of immediate application to the United States today, because we've wandered so far away from what I understand as the essence or the principles of conservatism. But B, I think there are first principles. I don't think Kirk would actually object to that. He does give you his own principles of conservatism, whatever he decides to call them. But I think that we might start sort of with the negative position. That is to say, there are certain things that those who are real conservatives should question. One of them is libertarianism, which starts with radical individualism, because conservatives believe human beings are necessarily the zoopolitica or politicae that Aristotle's. We are, in fact, social animals, and we're born into a social context. Human beings are, in fact, socially defective by themselves. And in fact, they're always dependent upon human relations in a complex of associations, very few of which they choose for themselves, which are necessary for their thriving and development as human beings. So I suppose we may share this even with Marxists, though we understand this in a different sense, that human beings are necessarily social animals. We're born into communities, and our thriving depends on organic relationships, very few of which we at least initially choose for ourselves. Okay. The other thing which I think which distinguish conservatives from neoconservatives, from leftists, from wokeists, and also from libertarians, is the acceptance of hierarchy as being natural to human existence. We might say human beings can be made equal by the state. The state may be able to do anything that it wants at this point in time, but human beings not only are dependent on other human beings, but we might say for the societies that can thrive and which do not look like woke America or woke Germany necessarily depend on inequality, right? I mean, children are dependent on parents. We would say in properly run societies, there is a whole, one might say, chain of command, subordination, and so forth. We would say this is natural to human existence. It is nothing we have to be embarrassed about. It's fine. We also accept gender distinctions. Gender distinctions are basic to the functioning of society. I mean, I know we're doing something else now, which looks utterly chaotic and which I'm sure will end in disaster. But normal societies make gender distinctions. Some make more than others. And typically they assign political roles to the males of human species. Women are, for understandable reasons, typically assigned the rearing of children and domestic roles. Now, I know that these conservative ideas go entirely counter to what we're seeing in our own society today, but that our own society, I would say, is in a state of disintegration. And unless it returns to something like these conservative principles, it will certainly not be able to survive much longer as any kind of coherent society that protects people. Another thing conservatives would not deny, and this might say is the Hobbesian principle, although Hobbes is not the first to have stated it, Aristotle, Aquinas, Burke make the same point, that in order for governments to enjoy our support, they must be committed to protecting us. I have no idea why I'm supposed to support a government that is not interested in protecting my life. And when I say that the natural right principles that libertarians and Jaffites and others accept is a variation on this, that assumes that individuals are born with rights. Conservatives normally do not accept the idea of human rights or individual rights with which we are born. Rights are historic, as conservatives understand them. And I know my insistence on this view, which partly comes out of my historical understanding, has caused me problems even with people who are political allies. But I think I adhere to the conservative view here that rights are historic. They can be sacred rights because they're sacred rights which come out of the historic experience of people. But to believe that individuals are born with having rights injected to them in birth or so, however the process is supposed to work, seems to me an indefensible position.
All right. Let me review a bit of that, because a great deal of that I agree with too.
Mm-hmm.
And in principle at least, there's no reason that a libertarian can't agree with most of that. And of course, even Ludwig von Mises didn't actually believe in the idea of individual rights. He took a Millian position on that,
Right.
and he was more of a utilitarian. So even Mises, who everyone would admit is a libertarian hero, even he wasn't comfortable with the idea of rights. So even that could be accepted by a libertarian. So a libertarian could say, man is a social animal, it's true, and his identity comes from organic relationships, but that it's best, given man's nature and how corrupt he is, it's best for him to interact in society through voluntary means and voluntary associations rather than through the state. You can still express your social nature through other groupings other than the U.S. government, would be how they would express it. Where I see us going off the rails is that there can be some very, very highly undesirable social movements going on that don't involve the use of coercion. And so the libertarian thereby feels like he has to be agnostic about them or possibly even encouraging them. Or you get something like whatever drag queen story hour and all the even worse stuff that we see in video all the time. And you get libertarians saying, well, how does this affect you personally? And that's their entire answer. And the correct answer to that question is, well, I don't want to live in a society like this. And unfortunately, for most libertarians, there's just no room in their worldview for that answer.
Mhm.
I don't want to live in a society like this. And for some reason, a lot of libertarians simply, and maybe it's a problem with libertarianism generally, they cannot accommodate that answer. I don't want to live in a society like this. In a society like this, it is much harder for human beings to flourish. And I don't want my own kids to be strung along by these crazy ideologies.
No, I totally agree with you. And moral judgments, I think, are necessary for the existence of society. And I would say traditional moral judgments and traditional social taboos are essential to what we'd say, I suppose, in an Aristotelian sense, is the flourishing of human beings. And I would also say some sense of human fallenness or sinfulness, that human beings, because of their inherent deficiencies, require social instruction. This, I suppose, goes counter to what libertarians may believe.
Well, another thing, again, this is not, let's say, this does not follow strictly from libertarian premises, but there are a lot of libertarians and people, let's say, historical figures in the classical liberal tradition who believe it, that the truth will win in the marketplace of ideas.
Mhm.
And now sometimes some libertarians will say, well, in our day and age, though, we don't really have a free marketplace of ideas. I mean, there's no disputing that. We don't really have a free marketplace of ideas because half the time our ideas are either suppressed in some way or they're made to seem odious before people even have a chance to entertain them. But for the sake of argument, we'll stipulate that we do have a free marketplace of ideas. At my age now, as I have, I think it can confidently be said, entered into the second half of my life, I no longer have the naive confidence that simply presenting a series of propositions to people will result in the majority of them picking the correct one. I don't even see how anyone can maintain that proposition anymore.
My question to you is sort of, given the very limited alternatives we have in terms of being able to live in a society of virtue, wouldn't it make sense simply to defend this liberal, classical liberal position, if only to protect ourselves against the left? I understand that we may be doomed anyhow, and the left, the totalitarian left, has so much power at this point, and is also so lunatic that it's not going to recognize our claim to free speech. But should we really abandon this? Is there any value in abandoning this position at this point in time? This is just something I'm thinking about. Is there any utility in taking that position, that we favor the protection of certain principles and we are therefore against entirely open speech?
Let me make sure I understand your question correctly. Are you saying, should we, given that all we have...
Utilitarian reasons, do we want to be seen as trying to restrict people's freedom of speech?
I see. Yeah, see, so I guess where I am right now in my thinking is that given the state of society, I want to be as parsimonious as possible in what I expect from others. If I have to convince everybody of certain conservative social standards, I think I'm going to lose. But if I have to convince them that everybody should have the right to speak freely and then we'll sort out what we think is right and what we think is wrong, I think I'll have much more success doing that.
I agree.
So I'm a libertarian and I talk about libertarian ideas. And I think at this stage, it's just a nice happenstance that at this stage of society, that is the most likely, even though there is no truly likely, but that's the most likely path to getting to the society I want, where, yeah, maybe in, let's say, the neighborhood I live in, yeah, I wouldn't want to live around neighbors who do and say completely bizarre and insane things all the time. Maybe if it got down to that, I would prefer something else. But for now, I think if I could just appeal to what sense of fairness might still remain in some people, then advocating for a kind of neutrality in the public square for the expression of ideas is probably the best we can hope for.
Yeah, it's the best we can hope for, but I think one has to also recognize that the liberal age is passing away, and libertarianism does not represent the totality of the liberal tradition, but it is part of that tradition, or it is a variant on that tradition. And liberalism is pretty much of a spent force, something that I made in that rejoinder to Yoram Hazony about the, is a debate between two woke leftists who are being banned by other leftists an attempt to preserve the liberal tradition? The answer is no. There's very little left if you reach that point. So neither one of us may be particularly convincing by making this libertarian argument, since the left is obviously not going to listen to anyone who stands in opposition. Although I think you're right, if they listen to an opposing argument, they're much more likely to listen to a libertarian one to any defense of conservative principle.
So in this kind of situation where, let's say, the elites who are in various places of power are completely against everything you and I believe and ridicule it and condemn it all the time, there are going to be, as we've seen, there'll be an enormous number of people who will tend to agree with them simply because they agree with whatever the elites tell them to think. And it becomes very, very hard to reach those people. But yet, I wonder if it were reversed. Let's say if Paul Gottfried were the U.S. president and the staff of Chronicles Magazine were running all the federal agencies and stuff like that, and were running the entertainment world. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if things would be, how much better they'd be, or if there is a natural tendency of societies to decay into decadence. I mean, I don't really know.
I think you're right about the natural tendency, but I think you're also right that many people go along with what exists because it is the establishment. I had a conversation with a younger person who was deeply offended that I had said something critical of Tony Blinken, pointing out that he had served in the federal government and had attended certain universities and was therefore a man I was supposed to respect because he had crossed all the right boxes and gone to the right schools. And I know a lot of people like this. It's okay if you have a race riot in Minneapolis because the people who are defending that race riot went to Yale and Harvard and were properly credentialed and are now working for the federal government. When I was in graduate school, I was always told that this was something characteristic of German authoritarian personality. I've now found out it's universal. Americans suffer from this to at least the same degree. And you see that 33% of Americans like the way Biden is running the economy, this national poll this morning. Well, that 33% would support Biden because he's the establishment, because he's the man in power. And these are people who may work for the government and are part of the governing class in our society. So if I were the president and the Chronicles staff were in my cabinet, I suspect we'd have lots of the same people following us. I mean, there are obviously ideological differences within the population. I recognize that. I also think a lot of people simply are establishmentarians and will try to conform themselves to whoever happens to be in power or whatever they see as the governing class, particularly these people are credentialed in the way they understand credentials.
Well, I think a great example of that is transgenderism. If you had asked somebody, let's go all the way back 15 years ago, if you had said, if somebody declares, even without any surgery or anything like that, just declares himself to be a woman when he's obviously, I mean, we all know he's a man. I mean, and by the way, let's just drop this pretense that we think that there's a possibility that this man is really a woman. We all know that's not true, okay? I'm not going to pretend that. And that's not evil, that's not bigoted. I mean, these are all stupid leftist words that are meant to shut down free thinking. Nobody would have thought you could then expect everybody to be happy about such a person competing against, the forbidden term is biological women in sports, or using their bathrooms, or whatever, any of this stuff, or demanding that the entire legal order of the West be overturned on this basis. Nobody would have thought that, because that was not the fashionable thing. And also because, even more importantly than that, it seems absurd on the face of it. But yet, as soon as a tipping point comes and it becomes the fashionable thing, even though it has become not one whit more persuasive than it was 15 years ago, for some reason it hits a certain tipping point and everybody's got to be on board.
Mhm.
And this has been such a demoralizing phenomenon for me to observe that it borderline makes me want to give up.
I can understand your reaction fully. Part of the reason that people have to affirm this new understanding of the world is that anybody who questions it is going to be condemned as a fascist, a Nazi, an anti-Semite, a racist. And then politicians and journalists and others will say that's the case. So no one wants to be excommunicated or fall out of social, professional favor. Therefore, they go along with whatever they're being told. I think the bullying and blackmail are very effective in destroying dissent. I think there also is an obsession in modern society with equality and righting the wrongs of one-time existing inequality. We have to do all we can to make people feel equal to each other, and members of groups that were once treated in an unequal fashion must be given compensatory treatment. So I think the whole transgender narrative sort of fits into that larger narrative, that we are committed to righting the anti-egalitarian wrongs of the past, and the transgendered people were excluded up until 5 years ago or 2 months ago, whenever they stopped excluding them and they became a favored group. So we all have to join in this latest affirmation of the doctrine of equality.
Who would you say are the thinkers who most help define your sense of conservatism?
It's sort of hard to say because my conservatism became defined and redefined at different points in my long life. But, I do remember as a college student reading Edmund Burke after reading the second treatise of John Locke and being much more convinced by Burke's observations about the French Revolution, which also contains his defense of historical right and so forth, than I had been by being exposed to Locke's treatise and his talk about the state of nature and natural right and so forth. So Burke had a profound influence on me. I wrote a doctoral dissertation on European counter-revolutionary thinkers, and they definitely influenced me. I think their understanding of social breakdown and revolution is really generally correct. And then I became interested in German thought and classical Greek thought. I've always been a fan of Thucydides, Aristotle, and I've read them in Greek more than once. I'm very impressed by ancient Greek thought and German, French, Italian, English thinkers whom I've studied. I did like some of the American conservatives I read, like Robert Nisbet, James Burnham. I liked Murray Rothbard, by the way, on his economic history. I was never convinced by his libertarian ideology, but I thought he was an excellent economics historian. And I remember liking Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind the first time I read it. I think I've been less impressed the older I've become. I wrote a book on Carl Schmitt, who's a very nasty fellow, but seems to have a profound understanding of human nature and political relations. Of all English thinkers, political thinkers, I think the one whom I like the best is Thomas Hobbes. His understanding of human nature is excellent. And there's almost a kind of Augustinian subtext when you read Hobbes, although he is, I suppose, an historical materialist. But he also definitely influenced me. So as you see, I'm sort of going from one thinker to the other, because depending on what stage of my life I look back at, I was probably influenced by different political, literary thinkers and so forth.
Well, something you just said prompted another thought. Do you think conservatism has to have a religious dimension to it?
I don't think it necessarily has to have one, but I think it helps.
What do you think it brings to it?
What it brings is a metaphysical or theological understanding of human limitations, which is expressed in the Christian doctrine of original sin, a sense of human limits, and also an awareness of living in a providential history. that, at the end of the day, there is a God and somehow God directs human affairs. Even if we're living in the worst of times, it may give us some hope that the situation we're living through can be changed because there is a divine input in what is happening on earth. I have read people who are neo-pagans, by the way, strike me as ridiculous. When I read them, I think that, at least in the West, conservatism has to have some Catholic or Protestant, possibly Orthodox, most Catholic or Protestant character. The neo-paganism doesn't work. For one thing, there haven't been pagans for several thousand years, though we do have a Christian or Judeo-Christian tradition in the West. And it's always very arbitrary, and it typically involves a rejection of Christianity, the neo-paganism. Christians, a disappointment with Christianity because it hasn't saved us from the latest manifestation of the left.
Or it has surrendered, various parts of it.
Yeah, definitely has surrendered at this point.
Yeah. They're not looking at a Christianity, because I promise you, Charlemagne would not have been woke.
No.
So
although they would argue Charlemagne was really a heathen, because if you're a Christian, you would have been, I suppose, like Pope Francis or someone they don't like.
I see. Well, I don't like Pope Francis either. So there's my overture to them.
Right.
Before I go on, let me say a quick thing that will help a lot of you, and you know who you are. If you are in business and you're getting buried by your competition online, then build your brand, your reputation, and your lead flow with digital marketing by Persist SEO, our great sponsor. If you're a small local business, you're trying to compete against large companies in the service industry, increase your visibility with Persist SEO. Or if you have low or no leads coming in on a consistent basis, well, website search engine and conversion optimization can help move the needle to a more prosperous business model for you. If you're tired of cold calling, use your website as a lead generation engine. If you're not showing up for your services on the search engines, then get found with Persist SEO's expert search engine optimization. All you have to do is call 770-580-3736 or visit them at ineedseo.help for a free website audit and consultation. That's 770-580-3736 or ineedseo.help. I think, in a way, conservatism and to a lesser extent libertarianism operate at a natural disadvantage precisely because of something you just said. That is a recognition of limits.
Mm-hmm.
It's very easy if you haven't really thought things through, you don't understand how society works, or you have no acquaintance with history, to get swept up in messianic promises about what a political figure or the state or whatever, the nation, can accomplish. We can do this and that and this. I mean, all you have to do is listen to State of the Union addresses in the U.S. These are all preposterous promises. Half of them are things they've promised for 50 years, and every time they try to do them, they either fail or the exact opposite happens, and yet nobody loses faith in it. And so meanwhile, we're the ones who have to come along and say, well, we have to temper our expectations for what we can accomplish, and these grandiose promises are as likely to come to grief as anything else. That's not as encouraging a message, is it?
No, it is not. I agree with you. Although I wonder if the State of the Union is the best example to give, because you typically have the party in power will praise what they hear. If a Republican gives a State of the Union address, it will immediately be attacked by the media, which are the handmaidens of the Democratic Party. But I think certainly the kind of idealism that I remember college students always expressing, we have to believe in the future. We have to believe in human beings or human nature or something like that. And this was like sort of typically, they would tell you that the Nazis were bad, not the communists, of course, but the Nazis were bad. And they killed a lot of people. And, they did run a nightmare society. Well, if you believe that, then why would you believe that human beings are destined always to be good? Well, the answer is you become anti-fascist. So then everything will be good. But I think this idealism can be extremely dangerous. And, faith in the future as an ideology always means that somebody's planning to build a totalitarian society and place me in it.
This is an enormous topic, so if you think it can't even be handled, you let me know. But what is your opinion on natural law as a basis for conservatism?
Yeah, I think one has to distinguish, and I know that this creates problems, between natural law and natural right. I think the classical medieval understanding of natural right has much to be said for it. The attempt to defend a normative, universally applicable morality by which we can judge positive or existing. I think this is very valuable for living in a decent ethical society of some kind. Natural right I see as being different. This is an early modern European invention which morphs into something like a universal religion by the 20th century. I don't see how you can really avoid speaking about universal moral norms. If you want to say we want to live in a decent society, there has to be you cannot say that we have a decent society for ourselves, but the morals by which we live may be the opposite of the way somebody else lives, and that's sort of equally good. By the way, I don't believe many people believe that. I think the notion of moral relativism has been vastly exaggerated.
I agree with you.
Yeah, most people do have their morals, even to the opposite of ours.
Yeah, the left today, the last thing you would say about them is that they're relativist.
Right. I think it's ridiculous.
No, they believe things and they're going to let you know it.
Right. They're fanatics.
Yeah.
They're all like Savonarola, and yet I hear these conservative so-called Fox News, and these people are relativist. But where are these relativists? I'd like to meet some.
I know. I could at least live next door to a relativist,
right.
Because he'll let me have my thing and he has his thing and that's it. Right.
Exactly.
I would take that at this point. No, we have absolutists of the worst kind. So the thing is, when you talk about natural law, a lot of people don't quite know what it means. Some of them think it means, or some of them will take the phrase live according to nature. And the thing is that you were talking about the Greeks, the Hellenistic thinkers had all different understandings of what live according to nature meant. I mean, some of them really did mean live according to nature. If something is not natural, that is, it's not occurring in nature, then we don't do it. So we don't cook our food because that's not natural. Like all that, that's crazy talk. That is not what we mean by live according to nature. Or to say having a mortgage is unnatural because it doesn't occur in nature. Or eyeglasses are unnatural because they don't occur in nature. No, the eyeglasses are natural in the sense that they contribute to the flourishing of the person. That's what's meant. So you live according to your nature. Your nature is a rational creature. And part of fulfilling what it means to be that is having good vision. And so the glasses contribute to that. So they're not, I have a dear friend who made this mistake in writing somewhere, and I wish he had just run it by me. I would have corrected him. Glasses are not a violation of natural law. They are an implementation of that idea. So it really boils down to the idea that in the same way that there are things that are good for your car and bad for your car. You put good gasoline in it, it runs better. You pump sand into it, it won't run at all. And we all know that. There's nothing relativistic about that. Well, in my car, no, this is true for everybody. And the thinking is that there are likewise certain things that are good for human beings that help them flourish to live as human beings, and things that are bad. But the thing is, I just don't feel like in a society as divided as ours that you could ever really compel assent to a set of, because I think people look at human flourishing differently.
No, I think you're right. The acceptance of gender distinctions as being natural, which of course you find in Aristotle and other people who develop theories of natural law and natural reason, and the Aristotelian term epikeia, like epiekes in Greek, that this is appropriate. It is not appropriate for a woman to act like a man, to dress like a man. By the way, everyone would have accepted that Aristotelian idea, up until maybe 25 years ago. But we also have to look at how societies function. And all societies, except for the one we're living in, which is in a state of increasing chaos, make gender distinctions, give different roles to men and women in terms of what are seen as their differing natures. You could get people to accept that, even if you tried to defend it in terms of natural reason or the uniformity of historical experience. They would say this is really unnatural, and all societies, particularly Western societies, have been unjust until now. And only if, every role is interchangeable and genders are interchangeable, as long as the state and the media tell us it's okay. These conditions must exist. Otherwise, we're living in an unjust, fascistic Nazi society or something like that. So you cannot convince people. I mean, things that seem self-evident to us, whether or not we attribute this to natural law or natural reason, is simply not self-evident to others. And as you said, nor does it conform to their notion of human flourishing.
You want to believe, the distinguishing characteristic of human beings, going back all the way to the Greeks, would say is reason. And yet, the kind of underlying implication of this conversation has been that reason is just not as powerful as we want it to be. So that leaves me with, then what do I do? Then politics in a, quote, democratic society then seems like almost inevitably deteriorates from, maybe it started nobly with people having articulate debates in the public square and may the better argument win, into simply a power play between two or more groups that you cannot reach through reason, that can't be argued with, and they're just going to grab power and, as Jeff Deist would say, vanquish the other side with that power.
Yeah, no, remember the principle of Thrasymachus in Book 1 of Plato's Republic, that the just is the advantage of the strong. And the strong here are the ones who control the media and the deep state, right? And what they say becomes true by virtue of the fact that people in power say this. And we are in that position. What makes it worse is that the people who are occupying power are moral nihilists, and they're inverting all traditional moral beliefs as part of their claim to power, or as an exercise of their claim to power. If they were just sort of ordinary authoritarian government, it wouldn't be as bad. The other thing that makes this worse than ordinary authoritarian government is the pretense that it's democratic. They can finesse elections, they can hold elections, finesse them, and so forth. And this is what the people want. We're just carrying out the will of the people while controlling education, while controlling all information sources. No other truth that really gets through to most people. So they do have this advantage that they can claim to be democratic, I suppose, in a way that Stalin or Hitler could not, right, once they took power. Now the power elites can afford to hold regular elections, and they might even win some of them fairly. So this, I would say, makes their inversion of morals all that more dangerous.
Well, I always want to, as I wrap up conversations, I like to leave people on an up note, but then I remember I'm talking to Paul Gottfried. So maybe if you can't say anything good about the direction of society, maybe you can say something good about Chronicles Magazine.
Mm-hmm. Are you asking me to say something good about it?
Yeah, why not?
I think it's an excellent magazine. I think it's one of the best magazines in the English language. And it is certainly the best magazine, dealing with political affairs. I wish we could get back to the subscription base that we had in the early 1990s. We had like 25,000 readers. Now we have nothing even close to that. But I think that one of the good things, the many good things about Chronicles, is we actually allow difference of opinion, which in the conservative movement today is remarkable. We have people on our editorial board, as you may have guessed, who differ dramatically on the Ukrainian-Russian war, and yet they work together. We all work together. I am the editor-in-chief. There are people under me, I suppose, not really under me technically, but not in terms of the work they do. They hold very different views from mine on many questions, and yet we can work together. There is common ground, to use the much overused phrase of Brett Baer in describing Republican-Democratic cooperation. We do have common ground, but we also allow for disagreement. Sometimes the disagreement goes on too long, so we have to cut it off. But it is remarkable how paleoconservatives, who are considered the most dogmatic people on the right, are actually the most democratic. We're the most open to debate, the most tolerant. And people who read Chronicles usually get more than one point of view on issues on which, I suppose, according to George, we all agree to agree. Well, at Chronicles, we haven't agreed to agree, so we go on debating. But I know Tom has been reading our magazine for many years and is a loyal fan who praises us whenever the occasion presents itself.
Well, I'll say something else about that. You're talking about people being able to disagree with each other. I would much rather read a challenge to what I think that's written by somebody who wants what's best for me and doesn't hate my guts. I'm much, much more open to listening and maybe even being convinced by somebody like that. And so that's why, even if I don't agree with everything in Chronicles Magazine, I know that the hearts of the people are in the right place in there, and that I'm at least going to get exposed to a perspective I didn't have before. So I highly recommend it. Again, chroniclesmagazine.org. You'll really enjoy it. It's fun to get it in the mail. And then when you get it in the mail, you can pull it out of your mailbox. You can think, oh, Woods is pulling this magazine out of his mailbox right about now. And I bet he's sitting down in his recliner taking a look at it. So I definitely strongly recommend chroniclesmagazine.org. And for all the time poor Paul spends here on the Tom Woods Show when there are all kinds of fun things he could be doing. I think the least we can do is subscribe to his magazine. So, Paul, thank you very much for your time again. I appreciate it.
And thank you for the plug.
My pleasure. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit TomWoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of the Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.